June 6, 1943, over the skies of Western Europe, the war thundered on. German pilots ruled the air with their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, mocking the newest American aircraft, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. They called it the flying bathtub, too fat, too heavy, too slow. To them, it looked like a joke built from spare metal and misplaced confidence, but that joke would soon become their nightmare. The Thunderbolt wasn't designed for elegance, it was engineered for survival. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine could take hits that would tear other planes apart. Under its thick steel skin, 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns waited like clenched fists of vengeance. By the summer of 1943, the U.S. 56th Fighter Group Zemke's Wolfpack began to show what the Thunderbolt could really do. When German fighters dived on American bombers, the P-47s came screaming out of the clouds, unleashing storms of bullets that ripped through aluminum and armor alike. Pilots who once laughed at the bathtub found themselves running for their lives. Those 8 machine guns could melt the sky in a heartbeat, turning enemy fighters into burning metal rain. The Germans soon learned altitude was no longer their ally. Thunderbolts could dive faster, strike harder, and still climb back into the fight. By late 1943, Luftwaffe reports spoke of metal beasts that ignored damage and returned fire like demons from the clouds. One pilot wrote, "We shot at them. They did not fall. They kept coming." By the war's end, the P-47 would prove itself one of the most feared aircraft in Europe, a symbol of unstoppable American might, forged not in beauty, but in brute survival, and the laughter had long since died. February 1944, the skies above France and Germany had become a new kind of battlefield. The Luftwaffe still fought fiercely, but the balance of power was shifting, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was leading the change. With drop tanks attached beneath its wings, the one short-range bathtub could now escort bombers deep into enemy territory. No longer tied to Allied lines, the Thunderbolt's roar echoed over Berlin, Hamburg, and the Ruhr. German commanders began calling it Der Eiserne Donnerschlag, the Iron Thunderclap. Its arrival meant one thing: devastation. The Thunderbolt's pilots learned to turn its bulk into an advantage. In a dive, the aircraft could reach speeds over 700 km per hour, faster than almost any fighter in the world. When it struck with the fury of a storm. Farmhouses, convoys, rail lines, anything that moved beneath its wings became a target. Its 8 heavy machine guns could tear apart a tank's engine deck, or shred a truck convoy in seconds. In the last months before D-Day, Thunderbolts rained fire on France, cutting off supply lines and paralyzing the German front. Many Luftwaffe veterans who once hunted bombers now refused to engage the P-47. They called it the beast you couldn't kill. Pilots told stories of Thunderbolts returning to base with wings riddled by cannon shells, oil leaking, metal burning, and still landing safely. By mid-1944, the American pilots flying them had become legends. Names like Francis Gabby Gabreski and Robert Johnson, men who fought outnumbered and returned victorious, became symbols of the Thunderbolt's spirit. In every engagement, the message was the same: you could outturn it, maybe even outclimb it, but once those 8 guns opened fire, you wouldn't live long enough to brag about it. The Thunderbolt was no longer mocked, it was respected, and to those who faced it, it was feared. June 6, 1944, dawn broke over Normandy, and the largest invasion in human history began. Above the beaches, the roar of hundreds of engines filled the air, and among them, the P-47 Thunderbolt led the charge. While ships pounded the coast and soldiers stormed the sand, Thunderbolts dove through clouds of smoke to strike German fortifications. They shredded bunkers, cut through machine gun nests, and silenced columns of armored reinforcements before they could reach the front. On that day, and every day that followed, the Thunderbolt became the hammer of the Allied advance. Each mission pushed deeper into France, Belgium, and beyond. Hunting trains, fuel depots, and convoys. Pilots joked that if you were a German truck driver in 1944, your worst nightmare wasn't running out of gas, it was hearing that distant thunder above. Even the feared Tiger tanks were not safe. A well-placed strike from 8.50 caliber guns could rip open their armor, and rockets mounted under the wings could finish the job. The ground crews called the P-47 a flying artillery battery, and the name fit perfectly. By the autumn of 1944, the skies over Western Europe belonged to the Allies. The Luftwaffe was bleeding, outnumbered, outgunned, and hunted relentlessly. The once mocked flying bathtub had become the executioner of the Reich's Air Force. Pilots returned from missions with bullet-scarred planes, oil leaking down their sides, engines coughing smoke, but they came back. The Thunderbolt's strength wasn't just its firepower, it was its refusal to die. Stories spread of pilots limping home with one wing torn, half a tail missing, landing gear gone, and yet somehow landing safely on Allied soil. The Germans began to call it Der Teufel aus Metall, the devil of metal. When its shadow crossed the fields below, panic followed, farmers fled from their tractors, soldiers abandoned their trucks, and even armored columns scattered for cover. April 1945, the war was ending, but the skies still burned. Over shattered German cities, the P-47 Thunderbolt roared one last time, not as a fighter chasing glory, but as a relentless force ensuring the enemy could never rise again. Bridges, rail lines, and convoys became its primary prey. Every day, hundreds of Thunderbolts swept across the Rhine, cutting supply routes, isolating entire divisions, and leaving behind only smoke and silence. The Luftwaffe, once proud and untouchable, now hid in the forests and abandoned airfields, powerless against the storm they had mocked 2 years before. In these final missions, Thunderbolt pilots learned to fight exhaustion as much as the enemy. They flew low, through walls of flak, trusting their armor to hold just long enough to finish the job. When engines caught fire or wings were torn by shrapnel, many stayed on course, determined to strike before bailing out. For every pilot lost, another took his place, and with each mission, the legend of the Flying Jug grew, a machine too tough to die, flown by men who refused to surrender. By May 1945, when the guns finally fell silent, the Thunderbolt stood as one of the most successful aircraft of the war. Over 7,000 enemy planes destroyed, thousands of tanks, trucks, and trains obliterated. No other fighter combined brute force, speed, and survival like it. When peace returned to Europe, the surviving pilots gathered one last time. They looked at their scarred, oil-stained machines, engines quiet, wings patched, bullet holes sealed with field tape, and they knew the laughter of their enemies had died long ago, buried under clouds of smoke and fire. What remained was respect for the plane, for the brotherhood, and for the sky they had conquered. And when the engines of history turned silent, one sound lingered still, the echo of the Thunderbolt's roar. Summer 1946, Europe was rebuilding, and the Thunderbolt rested. The mighty engines that once shook the skies were silent, lined up on airfields from England to France, wings streaked with soot, paint faded by the sun. Some were scrapped, melted into steel for the cities they had helped to save, but others were spared, preserved by those who couldn't forget what the Jug had done. For the pilots who survived, peace was both a gift and a burden. Many still woke at night to the sound of gunfire in their dreams, hearing the deep growl of the R-2800 engine echo through memory. They had faced death at 25,000 feet and lived to see blue skies again, yet every flight in a civilian cockpit felt empty, too quiet, too safe. The Thunderbolt, though retired, refused to fade away. In 1948, new conflicts flared in the East, and once more, the call came for machines that could take punishment and still strike hard. Veterans smiled, they already knew which aircraft fit that description. The P-47 returned, not as a relic, but as a teacher. Young pilots studied its thick armor, its dive angles, its firepower. Every lesson was paid for with blood, and none forgotten. At airshows across America, the roar of restored Thunderbolts drew crowds who had never seen war. Children covered their ears as engines screamed to life, shaking the ground just as they had over Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Rhine. Old pilots saluted, eyes glistening, hearing not the noise of an engine, but the heartbeat of their youth. The flying bathtub, once mocked and ridiculed, had become a monument, a symbol of defiance, endurance, and power forged in a world that demanded everything from those who flew it. Even decades later, when newer jets claimed the skies, no pilot ever forgot the Thunderbolt's creed: if you can bring me back home, you're more than a machine, you're a brother. 1960, the jet age had begun. Sleek, silver fighters sliced through the stratosphere at twice the speed of sound. The world had changed, wars were colder, weapons faster, yet the memory of the Thunderbolt refused to die. In hangars and air museums across America, the old Jug stood like a monument from another era. Children gazed at its thick armor and wide wings, unable to believe such a heavy machine could even fly. But for the men who once sat in that cockpit, the smell of oil and steel was enough to bring back the thunder of 1944. They gathered every year, the surviving pilots of Zemke's Wolf Pack and countless other squadrons. They told stories over coffee and laughter. But behind every smile was a memory of friends who never came home. The Thunderbolt had carried them through hell and back, and though many of the planes were gone, the bond remained. Some restored aircraft still took to the sky. At airshows, their engines roared once again, the same deep growl that once made German pilots tremble. Crowds cheered, but the veterans listened in silence. To them, it wasn't just noise. It was a voice, the voice of the past, of courage, of sacrifice. Over time, historians began to call the P-47 one of the unsung heroes of World War II. It lacked the sleek beauty of the Spitfire or the fame of the Mustang, but it had something rarer: indestructible will. It could not dance in the air, but it could fight, survive, and protect, and so the legend lived on, not through fame, but through respect. In every thunderstorm, in every rumble of distant engines, some still claim they hear the spirit of the old Jug soaring through the clouds. For those who flew her, it was never just an airplane, it was a symbol of what men could build and what they could endure, a machine that refused to fall. And a memory that refuses to fade. 1980, decades had passed since the guns fell silent, yet the world still carried echoes of that thunder. In classrooms and museums, new generations learned about the P-47 Thunderbolt, the plane that once ruled the clouds. To them it was history, to the men who had flown it, it was life itself. The jet age had moved on, bringing sleek machines that could reach the edge of space. But none could replace the raw power of the old Jug. It was more than a warplane, it was a story of resilience. Of courage forged in steel. Across America, restoration teams worked in quiet hangars, bringing forgotten airframes back to life. Piece by piece, rivet by rivet, they rebuilt the ghosts of 1944. When the engines finally roared again, mechanics cheered and veterans wept. The smell of burnt fuel and oil filled the air, and for a moment, the past lived again. Airshows became pilgrimages. Children pointed at the roaring P-47, their parents explaining that this bulky machine had once saved the free world. Pilots signed autographs with trembling hands, smiles hiding tears. They knew time was catching up with them. Each year, fewer of their comrades returned for the reunions. Chairs stayed empty, names were read aloud, and the thunder grew quieter. But the legacy refused to die. Historians began calling the Thunderbolt the soldier's aircraft, the one that protected more lives than it ever took. Its strength was its mercy, it survived so its pilot could come home. By the 1980s, only a handful of airworthy P-47s remained, yet every time one took off, the ground shook with history. The roar wasn't just an echo of war, it was the heartbeat of a generation that had refused to surrender. And though the sky now belonged to jets and satellites, the spirit of the Jug still flew among the clouds. A reminder that even metal can have a soul. 1980, decades had passed since the guns fell silent, yet the world still carried echoes of that thunder. In classrooms and museums, new generations learned about the P-47 Thunderbolt, the plane that once ruled the clouds. To them it was history, to the men who had flown it, it was life itself. The jet age had moved on, bringing sleek machines that could reach the edge of space. But none could replace the raw power of the old Jug. It was more than a warplane, it was a story of resilience. Of courage forged in steel. Across America, restoration teams worked in quiet hangars, bringing forgotten airframes back to life. Piece by piece, rivet by rivet, they rebuilt the ghosts of 1944. When the engines finally roared again, mechanics cheered and veterans wept. The smell of burnt fuel and oil filled the air, and for a moment, the past lived again. Airshows became pilgrimages. Children pointed at the roaring P-47, their parents explaining that this bulky machine had once saved the free world. Pilots signed autographs with trembling hands, smiles hiding tears. They knew time was catching up with them. Each year, fewer of their comrades returned for the reunions. Chairs stayed empty, names were read aloud, and the thunder grew quieter. But the legacy refused to die. Historians began calling the Thunderbolt the soldier's aircraft, the one that protected more lives than it ever took. Its strength was its mercy, it survived so its pilot could come home. By the 1980s, only a handful of airworthy P-47s remained, yet every time one took off, the ground shook with history. The roar wasn't just an echo of war, it was the heartbeat of a generation that had refused to surrender. And though the sky now belonged to jets and satellites, the spirit of the Jug still flew among the clouds. A reminder that even metal can have a soul. 1995, half a century had passed since the guns of Europe fell silent. The world was unrecognizable, satellites circled above, computers replaced typewriters, and wars were fought on screens instead of skies. Yet the memory of the Thunderbolt still refused to vanish. At commemorations of D-Day and V-Day, the old pilots appeared in their faded uniforms, medals clinking softly against their chests. Their steps were slower, but when they looked to the sky and saw a P-47 pass overhead, their eyes lit up with the fire of youth. Each flyover was more than a tribute, it was a resurrection. The deep rumble of the radial engine seemed to whisper across time, "We are still here." Museums began to preserve not just the planes, but the voices. Interviews, journals, and crackling radio recordings told the story of men who had faced death with steady hands and iron hearts. Young mechanics restored each aircraft as if breathing life back into an old friend, polishing metal that once carried heroes into battle. The internet gave the Thunderbolt a second life. Videos of its takeoffs, stories of its missions, and photos of smiling pilots spread across the world. Teenagers who had never known war listened in awe to the sound of 8.50 caliber guns tearing through the air. They called it pure history in motion. As the new millennium dawned, only a few veterans remained. Their reunions were smaller now, fewer hands to shake, more empty chairs each year, but the bond between them never weakened. They spoke of courage, of fear, of friendship, and always of the Jug. When the last pilot of Zemke's Wolfpack took his final flight, the crowd fell silent. The Thunderbolt climbed into the clouds and disappeared into the sun, a farewell salute from one generation to another. The legend no longer needed men to tell it, the sound of its engine, echoing across decades, had already told the world everything it needed to know. 2020, nearly 80 years had passed since the Thunderbolt first took flight, yet its name still carried weight in every hangar, every museum, every heart that loved the sky. The world had changed beyond recognition. Wars were fought by drones, pilots trained in simulators, and engines whispered instead of roared. But when a restored P-47 rumbled to life, heads still turned. Its sound was different, raw, ancient, alive. Crowds gathered at airshows, phones raised, children on their father's shoulders, watching the Jug Thunder past in a low flyby. In that brief moment, time seemed to bend. The 1940s weren't gone, they were right there, roaring above the runway. Restoration groups across the world kept the legend alive. In England, France, and the United States, engineers and historians worked side by side, searching scrapyards for forgotten parts, rebuilding engines by hand, painting every silver panel with reverence. Each finished aircraft wasn't just a relic, it was a voice from the past, reminding mankind of what courage once sounded like. Documentaries, books, and digital archives began to retell its story. The Thunderbolt appeared in films, video games, and classrooms, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of endurance. Pilots of modern jets, flying machines far more advanced, still spoke of the Jug with respect. They called it the grandfather of survivability. For the few surviving veterans, each public flight was a farewell. They watched their beloved aircraft climb once more, the sun glinting off its wings, and smiled through tears. The roar faded, but their memories didn't. When asked what the Thunderbolt meant to them, one old pilot simply said, "It was freedom, and it had a heartbeat." In a world obsessed with speed and precision, the Thunderbolt reminded everyone of something deeper, that victory was never about beauty or perfection, but about strength, loyalty, and the will to return home. Epilogue. The sky was calm, a deep blue ocean stretching endlessly above. Somewhere, far away from war and noise, a single Thunderbolt waited in a museum hangar, its wings reflecting the soft light of morning. Dust rested gently on its metal skin, but its spirit was untouched. Generations had passed since it last saw combat, yet the air around it still carried the echo of courage. Visitors stopped to read the plaques, to take photos, to imagine what it must have been like to fly through smoke, through fear, through chaos, and still come home. For those who truly listened, the silence spoke louder than any engine. It told a story not just of machines, but of men, of 19-year-olds who faced the impossible and did it anyway. Their bravery was carved into the rivets, painted in the faded insignias, and preserved in every scar along the fuselage. Somewhere in the crowd, an old veteran stood watching, his hair white, his hands trembling, but when he saw the Jug before him, he didn't see an artifact, he saw his youth. His comrades. The sky that had once belonged to him. For a moment, the years disappeared. The engine roared again, if only in his memory. The Thunderbolt was never the fastest, never the prettiest, never the most famous, but it was loyal. It was fearless. It endured when others fell. It was, in every way that mattered, human, and that is why its legend survived long after the last battle ended. When people look up today and hear the distant rumble of thunder, they may think it's just a storm rolling in. But those who know the story, those who remember what courage sounds like, understand that it might just be something else, not the storm of weather, but the echo of a machine that refused to die, the echo of men who once ruled the skies, the echo of the Thunderbolt.